Welcome to the conversation. I'm Paul Grondahl, the director of the New York State Writers Institute at the University of Albany. Very excited for today's guest, George McNamee. He's chairman of Plug Power, which is a leader in the hydrogen economy. He's also a venture capital investor. And we're here to talk today about the trial of the Chicago Seven. George is an editor of this new edition to coincide with a just released film by Aaron Sorkin on Netflix. He edited this volume with Mark Levine and Daniel Greenberg. Welcome to the conversation, George.
Thank you, Paul.
So I want to go back to 1968, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. The trial came out of when police clashed with anti-Vietnam War protesters, and then the whole trial, this kind of extraordinary circus in a courtroom in 1969, and then you editing this, I think it was 22,000 pages of testimony and court documents. So take us back to where you were in 68, 69 and how you got involved in this project.
Okay. Paul, I was in college in 68. I'm class of 69 in college. And in the spring of my junior year, I decided to go to Wisconsin and work for Gene McCarthy and, end the war all by myself.
Right.
And I had the very good luck in Wisconsin of being assigned to work for Mark Levine. And so that's how Mark and I got to know each other. Danny, by the way, was, best friend of Mark's growing up. They were both Columbia law students. I was a mere undergraduate. We had a great time. We beat Lyndon Johnson by more than 2-1 in our town. We did really well.
Right.
And, the Sunday night before the Tuesday primary, Johnson was on the tube and announced he wasn't going to run and really denied us our victory. So that's how Mark and I met. The book came out of a conversation that he and I had. We'd been following the trial. We knew some of the people. We'd been following the trial. We knew some of the reporters. The coverage in the American media was very, sort of pro-establishment. The peaceniks must be wrong. Mayor Daley was a powerful figure, and when Ramsey Clark, the Attorney General until January of '69, looked at this case, and he had his investigators dig in, and they decided that the riots had been started by the police and that there was no case.
Right.
And Nixon had a compliant attorney general, a subservient attorney general, John Mitchell, and his former law partner. And Mitchell was happy to use the Justice Department to attack Nixon's enemies.
Right.
And so they, thus the trial of the Chicago, originally 8, later finally 7.
Right. So, you grew up in Albany, and then you went to Yale University. You were a history major. Were you part of the 1968 convention? Did you go, or did you try to go? Or?
Well, I wanted to go. My father talked me out of it. He had friends in the party in Chicago, and he had heard that that any demonstrators who went to Chicago were going to be treated very roughly.
Right.
And the Mayor Daley was famous for having said that shoot to maim looters and shoot to kill arsonists.
Right.
And he shared Nixon's basic thought that protesters were criminals,
Right.
and and he had the additional motivation that he wanted to prove that it wasn't the fault of the Chicago Police Department.
Right.
So somebody had to be at fault, and so thus the trial of the Chicago Seven, looking for some some people to blame.
Exactly. I've mentioned to you when I was researching and writing my biography of Albany's legendary mayor, Erastus Corning II, I found letters from Corning to Daley congratulating him on the tactics he used and being very aggressive and even violent against the anti-war protesters, which actually shocked me at the time. I never really thought he was, that was part of his MO. But recall growing up in Albany, and as the war was growing and the demonstrations were increasing, was this something that Albany supported in general with young people your age, or were, it was a divisive war certainly, but I'm trying to get at the mood of Albany in the 1960s, while you were becoming politically conscious and before you went off to New Haven.
Well, in '68, the opposition to the war had been growing for several years, and among young people, it was, pretty dramatic, and it was dramatic here. There was a McCarthy campaign in Albany that literally had 5,000 or 6,000 volunteers, and was enormous, and pulled together very rapidly. So I think that Albany shared the same general sense that its young people were dramatically opposed to the war, and my parents' generation tended to be, pro. My parents weren't. My parents were they were liberal Democrats and anti-war. But
yeah, I regret I didn't get to know your father, but I knew your mother pretty well. The exquisite Barbara McNamee Dudley, and she was a force. I figured she might have been influential on your politics. She was progressive, always ahead of her time, as long as I knew her.
Yes, and she, for instance, was, went to Martin Luther King's March on Washington in 1963, and she was a very. Both of them were active in the civil rights movement, and my father was a longtime treasurer of the Urban League. But so they were very anti-war, and the dinner table conversations were heated, but they were heated because my father thought the war was a terrible tragedy, and he thought that Johnson had really lost it, and we were there chanting, ho 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 Chi Minh, NFL is bound to win.
Right.
So, it was the divisions around the table were between very opposed to the war and really, really, really opposed to the war.
Right. So this is the book that you edited, and it first came out in 1970, The Trial of Chicago 7. As I mentioned, Mark Levine, Daniel Greenberg, and yourself. So when did you get the idea to, basically you edited the transcript. When did you get the idea to publish it as a book, and how did you divide these 22,000 pages of testimony and things to come up with a readable interesting volume. And we'll talk about the colorful cast of characters that were part of that trial, kind of a who's who of the culture of the 1960s. But how did the idea come about?
Well, what I remember.
Yeah, if you remember the 60s, you weren't there. I've heard that many times.
So Mark Levine, I had moved after college. I'd moved to New York, and I was working on the floor of the stock exchange. And Mark and I shared an apartment on East 83rd Street, and he was working for one of the big, white shoe New York law firms. And we were sitting around one night talking, and he was working on a 30-year-old U.S. Steel tax case. I think it was U.S. Steel. And I asked a bunch of questions. How do you work on a trial that took place 30 years ago?
Right.
And well, he said, you get the transcript and, the transcript. Yeah, the transcript. I said, well, does every trial have a transcript? Well, yeah. And we simultaneously got the idea we should get the transcript for the then still in process, still in progress for the Chicago trial.
Right.
And we did, and what we both knew about were how to build, I didn't know much about Wall Street yet, but I knew how to build volunteer organizations, and Mark did too. He'd worked for John Lindsay, then he'd worked for Gene McCarthy, and so we built a volunteer organization to help us edit the book.
Oh wow! So I mean,
lots of pizza, and and
and I mean, this was before technology. Now they would just give you a zip file or shared drive on Dropbox or something. But how did you get this document? I mean, it must have been several boxes. I mean, 20.
Oh, it was. And by the way, we bought the transcript from the court reporter. It was her personal property.
Right.
You think, well, it's a public record.
Right.
Well, sort of. It's sort of a public record, but it's her personal property.
And she's kind of a character for a moment in the film, and we'll get to the film. But so how much did it cost? Do you remember? I mean, 22,000 pages is a...
Well, don't hold me to the numbers, but something like 10 cents a page for the first 15,000 pages, or 16,000. And then she figured out that we had a plan to do a book.
Right.
And she decided that wasn't fair and that she deserved some of that money.
up the per page cost? So she got a back end percentage? Or?
Exactly. Anyway.
So, I mean, the other thing is, this was before social media and instant coverage. How are you following the trial? I mean, and we'll talk about these wonderful, you've rendered them in color, these sketches from the court sketch artists, but this was before cameras in the court and things, so you could only read kind of the next day's story, and it wasn't instant like it would be now with cable and social media. So how were you following the trial in real time? Were you glued to the coverage?
Well, we were reading the papers, but we also knew people who were there.
Okay.
And the reporting, several of the reporters told us that their work was being edited to change the flavor. So
a little censorship there, huh? Yeah.
Censorship, right. So we were told by the guy who covered it for the Times that he had written a story which said, the defendant said and the judge shouted. And the editors changed that to the defendant shouted and the judge said.
Wow. Yeah.
And that's the motivation that got us originally going. This story is not being told.
No. And the whole thing was a setup and a sham, which we'll talk about. But these main characters and Sorkin, it's tremendously cast, wonderful actors in all these parts. But did you know any of the principals? So Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin from the Yippies, or Tom Hayden of the Students for Democratic Society, or Dellinger, I forget his group, but did you know any of the organizations?
Dellinger was in my father's class in college.
Really? I love his character in the movie. I mean, that guy's really good. He was in
and he was
your father Yale too, or where was your father?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so Dellinger was the class activist, and he was the only member of the class who refused to fight in World War II on conscientious objection grounds.
Wow.
And he had been active in every peace and civil rights and nuclear disarmament of event in the whole 20 years since he'd graduated from college.
Right.
And he was a character.
I mean, I love his portrayal. I can't recall the actor's name, but he's a well-known character actor. He's just an everyday, he's a suburban father. He's literally the Boy Scout leader, which comes out in the trial. I mean, he was kind of the everyman. Did you have, I know there were Albany chapters and certainly New Haven probably of SDS. Were you ever involved with that group or ever come across?
I have a sister cousin who you may have met, Paul, Claire. And she was when she was in college, she was involved with SDS.
Yeah. So when you were reading coverage of the trial, certainly I think it's free press. I mean, I think that's the heart of it. And I think the film brings that out, getting to the truth, letting this judges, this corrupt political system kind of manipulate it. But the spark was you were angered that this was being twisted and the truth wasn't being told. Is that kind of the drive?
Yeah, and that the trial we thought the trial was really important.
Mm-hmm.
That this was the government attempting to prove that it was illegal to protest.
Right.
They had intentionally selected this cross section of leaders of various parts of the peace movement. The conspiracy was created by the government.
Right. The
government selected all these people and brought them together. We were appalled, and the grown-ups didn't get it. They just assumed, if the Justice Department indicts somebody for conspiracy to cause a riot, well, they must be guilty.
Right.
And we're going, well, it's America. They cross state lines in an illegal frame of mind.
Right.
When did that become illegal? So we thought it was a terribly important case. There was a real sense of solidarity among our generation at that point. Woodstock ended and the trial began 3 weeks later.
Right.
I mean, this was, one of the seminal events of this whole period.
And there's so many connections to today. I mean, the outrage, Sorkin does a nice job of very quickly kind of capturing the tumult and the tragedy of 1968, Martin Luther King assassination, Bobby Kennedy assassination, violent, encounters between police and demonstrators. But I thought a really significant part of this film, Bobby Seale, head of the Black Panthers Party, was called to the trial. Again, just kind of trying to make a display of him as a symbol of racial unrest, I think. But what they did to him in that trial, and you have a photograph of it in the book from the trial sketch artist. And it's a great performance in the trial. I mean, they handcuffed him, bound and gagged him, and brought him into court. And it looked like the worst kind of systemic racist abuse that I've seen. What did that moment?
Paul, it was worse than it appears in the movie.
Right.
He was bound and gagged and shackled and chained to the chair. But it wasn't for a couple of hours until the prosecution moved for a mistrial. It went on for 4 days.
Right.
For 4 days, he was in the trial, unable to speak, unable to move. If there was ever a graphic illustration of how, in those days, the civil rights of whites could be different from the civil rights of blacks, you can't imagine any of the white defendants who were happy to disrupt the proceedings, at every chance.
Right.
And they understood from the beginning that the judge intended to convict them.
Right.
He was Daley's former law partner.
Right.
He was randomly selected to be sure to convict.
But I think what they didn't bank on the very smart and clever, certainly Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, their ability and understanding of political theater. I mean, Sorkin brought that out so well in the film. It's very funny in a lot of it. I mean, sort of a black humor, a absurd humor. But talk about some of the stunts that Hoffman pulled out, and then the people that came from Allen Ginsberg to Norman Mailer to all these kind of cultural figures, and they didn't also just roll over and play the game. They all had their moment of subterfuge and resistance. But talk about that element when they knew it was a sham, and they made a big joke of it.
So the day the trial started, the prosecutor begins with his opening statement. And by the way, if you read the entire opening statement, it's gobbledygook.
Right.
And in the trial, in the movie, it appears to be actually, English. It's not, okay? In the transcript, it's remarkable the way he wanders. And can I just read you one little bit?
Yes.
Just to give you.
And I appreciate that you edited the 22,000 pages down to 300 or so, or 265. And I mean, yeah, it keeps making hints in the film and things. Did it ever come out? Was he early onset of dementia, the judge, who happened to also be named Hoffman? But it seemed like his mind wasn't all together,
Well, that's a defense for Hoffman that may make Hollywood sense. We thought he was the essence of evil, and it never occurred to us that he was worthy of sympathy because he had an early onset dementia.
Right.
We just thought he was a pig. He was a terrible guy. Okay, so here's the prosecutor opening statements. The defendants, Dellinger, Davis, and Hayden, joined with 5 of the defendants who were charged in this case in their venture to succeed in their plans to create in Chicago during the time of the Democratic Convention was convened here. 2 of these defendants, and by the way, that's not English, right?
Right.
2 of these defendants, the defendant Abbie Hoffman, who sits, who's standing for you, ladies and gentlemen, the jury is directed to disregard the kiss thrown by the defendant Hoffman, and the defendant is directed not to do that sort of thing again.
Yeah, I mean,
this is the first day.
It's so in the film, Sacha Baron Cohen portrays Abbie Hoffman and Frank Langella as Judge Hoffman. 2 great performances. What I also like is in your notes you talk about you're not doing what the New York Times editor did. You are giving them enough rope to hang themselves. The absurdity of it. You are putting in ellipses where you take things out, but you don't editorialize. You don't change things up for effect. This is a historical document, and you're very careful about the truth and accuracy of it. But it just comes out absolutely. It was a sham,
And it's funny.
Right.
It's dramatic. The dialogue is remarkably good. And it's addictive.
Right.
You start reading this thing, it's it's theater of the absurd.
Right.
It's absolutely, I think it's really interesting. And I think it's remarkable how well our, when I reread the book for the first time in a few years, and I was like, this is really pretty good. We really did this well. So, pleasant surprise.
So what was the reaction to it when it was first published? Did it sell well? Did people review it? Was anybody angry that you would do this?
Well, the Times was mad at us. They gave us a mixed review because they just couldn't believe that it was as bad as we showed it to be.
Right.
They ended up concluding, and they ended up concluding that the book was often they'd one of those sentences that publishers like to use. That the book was often hysterically funny, that it was very serious, and that it was important documentary history.
Right. Yeah.
They didn't approve. We're the New York Times, and we don't approve.
So, brilliant timing with the tie-in to the movie, The Trial of the Chicago 7. Just premiered Netflix Friday night, a couple days before we're recording this. I watched it and was tremendously moved and greatly entertained. And there's a foreword in your book by Aaron Sorkin, and he talks about how it all started with a visit to Steven Spielberg's house. And Spielberg was interested, and Sorkin said, now I better go home and read what he said. Yes, I'm interested. Now I better go read what the trial was about. He knew a little bit about it. And then Spielberg says, well, why don't you direct it too? He first wanted him to write the script based on, your book. And then he became the director. And talk about, did you have any interaction with the filmmakers and with that process?
None. And, to be fair about it, he said that he read 10 books.
Right.
So while I think he probably read ours, and I'm very grateful that he wrote the introduction. I think that's really great. But I'm not saying that he wrote his screenplay from our book. His screenplay is wonderful, and there's one scene not quite halfway through the book where the judge is fighting with Abby Hoffman, and the judge doesn't like Abby's behavior, and Abby says, in effect, if you like the trial, wait until you see the movie. And the judge says, you be quiet. And Hoffman says, well, the movie's going to be better.
That's great.
Isn't that wonderful?
I love that. I also, there were so many kind of theatrical stunts. It's in the movie. You've got a picture of it from the art, the courtroom artist. Hoffman and Rubin appear in judges' robes for one of
right. Right. And there's a scene in which you can see the court artists.
Right. Right.
And they're two particular ones, and we had huge fun when we put the new edition together. I think we went through 300 or 400 of these paintings, and there many of them are both beautiful art,
Right.
but they're also sort of very powerful. Did you see the one of Abbie Hoffman standing on his head?
Yeah, which is great. I mean, that's one of my favorite. But the bound and gagged.
Well, let me tell you
Bobby Seale is.
Let me tell you the backstory on Abbie standing on his head. Okay, and it's the afternoon before, and they're listening to one of these. All of the prosecution witnesses are in the government's pay. They're all undercover agents or FBI agents or whatever.
Right.
And so one of these guys is up on the stand, and Abbie turns to Kunstler and he says, "Is this guy hurting us?" And Kunstler goes, "Are you kidding me? He's killing us. This guy's killing us." And Abbie says, and they'd concluded for the day. The guy was going to be back on the stand again in the morning. And Abbie says, "Well, you want me to make him go away?" And Kunstler says, "Well, what are you talking about?" The next morning, Abbie does the handstand on the defense table. And it's all the press writes about.
Right.
The witness might as well never have existed.
There's just some great scenes. I mean, the casting. So Sacha Baron Cohen as Abbie Hoffman.
Brilliant.
Eddie Redmayne as Tom Hayden is I think the heart of the film, in a way, that how his transformation, from kind of straight-laced against the tactics and absurdity of Hoffman and Rubin, and then the way they come around. I won't give away the ending, because it's carried through the film, what Rennie Davis is doing during these days and days. I mean, almost 5 months. I don't know the historical accuracy of that. Was that true? Was he writing all those names during the trial, or was that a Hollywood touch?
I didn't know that he was writing them during the trial, but I do know that they read them.
Mm-hmm.
And that powerful scene where Tom Hayden reads the names of the young Americans who've been killed,
right,
that really happened.
Yeah, and it does bring it back. I mean, there's some great humor throughout your book and throughout the film, but it brings it back of all those tens of thousands of young lives lost, and a war that was a lie and an absurdity from the beginning. And then we can't forget, in the park in Chicago, those young people who had their skulls beaten in. And I think Sorkin also captured the terror of that moment, the tear gas, police coming in swinging batons. There's nothing humorous about that. And he sort of plays all those levels and all those emotions. But there were many people severely injured in that the police started. They had no need to go in there and get violent with the
And Paul, it was totally unnecessary. The police outnumbered the demonstrators at that point,
right,
by at least 2 to 1, perhaps 3 to 1.
Right, and they had the National Guard there too, not just the police. Yeah.
And the National Guard, were armed and in general with loaded weapons.
Right.
Right after this trial ended, Bobby Seale went to New Haven for the Panther trial.
Right.
And and that was a massive demonstration, but I think for lots of reasons, but in part because the undergraduate student marshals did such a good job. But the National Guard were there with loaded weapons, and the marshals were able to move the crowd off the town green and up into the campus, and away from the National Guard. 4 days later, at Kent State, very similar situation. The National Guard fired and killed 4 of the students.
Right.
And they were, not threatened. The students were 100 yards away. If those kids were frightened, they were right to be frightened.
Right. That's why I want to talk about, and I think it gets to the heart of why you wanted to, bring this new edition out, even before you knew about the film and things, because it resonates and connects with today, that this moment of reckoning now with Black Lives Matter, and the police response in many instances, not unlike in Chicago. They've come in with tear gas, with batons, with let alone the dozens of unarmed Black people who've been killed by police violence. So talk about how you see the connection to 1968, 69, and 2020.
Well, Paul, I think that there's so many connections. I think of, the rogue president with his subservient attorney general, determined to use the Department of Justice as a weapon against his enemies. And, in Nixon's case, the leaders of the peace movement were among his principal. He had many enemies.
He had his enemies list. He had a big list, but I'm sure Trump is. So basically you switch the name of Trump and Nixon and Mitchell and Barr, and you're right back there, right?
And you could just, you have the same kind of massive national movement and civil rights and ending the war. And you had a president who thought that protesting was a crime and that protesters were criminals.
Right.
And who encouraged police forces to use excess force. Encouraged it.
Right.
There's one wonderful line from Mayor Daley, which you'll probably remember when I tell you. But Daley actually said, the role of the police is not to create disorder, it's to preserve disorder.
Yes. Beautiful.
But his police force, he's famous for saying that shoot to kill looters and shoot to wound looters and shoot to kill arsonists. That specific quote from Daley was used again by our president just a few months ago.
Right, I know.
That's where he got it.
History keeps cycling itself. So, I mean, this is a trial about free speech and the right to protest, to assemble. I mean, it's a constitutional right. It's been challenged, it's been battered, it's been beaten up over the years. But where are we now? We're recording this less than 2 weeks before this, historic presidential election. Do you feel hopeful or less hopeful than you did in 1969 about the future of our republic? I mean, you've been involved in politics and active in civic affairs for a long time. You feel like, will this election change anything, is my question too, with our tribalism and our divisions and
Paul, I want you to think about how the world would have been different if Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy had survived.
Right.
Bobby would have won. He had just won the California primary. He would have won the New York primary.
Right.
He would have gotten the Democratic nomination. He would have been elected president. Instead, we elected a president with a Southern strategy, an overt appeal to racism.
Right.
in early 68, I was incredibly excited about, I was angry about the war, but I was excited about what was possible. When Bobby Kennedy got in the race, I thought, this isn't just a protest anymore. We're gonna win. So now, fast forward 50 years, I think that I think there are a lot of reasons to be really hopeful.
Right.
And the idea that people have found their voices, and so yeah, no, I think I'm encouraged. It's tough, but I'm encouraged.
That's good to hear. I like your optimism. I also like how you added kind of an appendix, and where are they now, to these figures that in many cases it was kind of the pinnacle of their public life or their careers in some way. And we don't have time to go through them all, but I mean, some kind of stayed true to that activist, anti-establishment. Rubin, though, became a stockbroker, an investment banker, and things.
Now, Paul, not the worst thing in the world.
Not the worst. I agree. You can make a lot of money and do good things with your money. But I think like Rennie Davis stayed true to sort of the activism. And which of the seven stuck out in your mind for, and several have passed away, of course, including Abby Hoffman.
Look, Tom Hayden was a member of the legislature in the state of California for a long time.
Right.
And he had the good sense to marry Jane Fonda.
Yep.
And so that was a power couple that was, powerfully supportive of human rights around the world and of peace. And so I think that, he led an interesting life. Let me tell you one little thing I just learned, Paul. So I wrote a little thing for the class notes for my college class. One of my classmates had John Freund's freshman year as his lab teacher.
Wow.
In freshman chemistry.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And he stayed in touch with Freund's, and Freund says, in the movie, you get the impression that Freund doesn't know why he's been, why he's even there. Right.
Right.
But he became deeply involved in the environmental movement, and he chaired, part of the CARB. He chaired the California review board for airborne contaminants. I mean, this is, that California is where an awful lot of the law gets made in these things, and so that's an interesting and useful life, and and I admire him too, because I think most of us have stayed committed to positive change. We've found other ways to do so, but I think that the part of the answer to climate change is going to be building a hydrogen economy, and that's kind of my way of protesting in the streets now that I'm much too old.
And
I did actually do one.
We're very glad you didn't get your head beaten in Chicago in 1968.
Right, none of this would be possible.
Yeah. So I think we'll wrap it at that. We could go on, and I look forward to more conversations. The book is now available in your local booksellers, your independent booksellers, online. The Trial of Chicago 7, edited by George McNamee, our guest today, along with Mark Levine and Daniel Greenberg. It's also the tie-in to a wonderful new film, The Trial of Chicago 7, just released on Netflix. directed by Aaron Sorkin with an all-star cast. George, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you very much for being on the conversation.
For me too. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.